My foreign fiancée and her family pressured me to marry. I secretly learned their language and recorded them planning to rob me. They turned out to be a criminal network with 7 victims and $300K stolen. I'm 28 years old, I work in tech, and what I'm about to tell you still feels like a movie every time I think about it. About a year and a half ago, I met this girl, Oksana, at a networking event. You know, one of those where everyone's kind of awkward with a glass of cheap wine in their hand trying to seem interesting. She was different, or that's what I thought at the time. She had this energy that was like sophisticated but accessible. She spoke 3 languages, had traveled all over the world, and when she told me stories about her childhood in another country, I was fascinated. I guess from the beginning there were signs. Little weird things that my brain registered but that I ignored because, honestly, I was in love, or whatever it is you feel when you meet someone who seems perfect. We dated for a year and a half before I proposed, and during that time, everything seemed normal. I mean, we had our fights like any couple, but nothing out of the ordinary. She worked in some consulting thing. She was always busy but never talked much about the details of her job, which in retrospect should have seemed strange to me, but at the time I thought she was just being discreet or that her work was boring. I met her family about 6 months into dating. Her mom, Svetlana, her stepdad, Igor, and from the first moment they seemed kind of off to me, like too friendly, too interested in my job, in how much I made, in my future plans. But I thought, well, they're from a different culture. Maybe that's how they show interest in their daughter's boyfriend. When I proposed to her in December last year, she said yes and cried, and all the theatrics. It was at a nice restaurant, nothing super fancy, but decent. And I remember the next day her mom called me directly, which seemed weird to me because she normally talked to Oksana first, and she told me she was very happy, and that we were family now, and that I had to come visit them that weekend to celebrate. I went, obviously, and it was this. A whole thing with traditional food from their country and vodka and toasts. And at some point during the night, Svetlana mentioned, kind of casually, that it would be wonderful if Oksana and I moved in with them for a while, just until we found our own place after the wedding, that that's how it was done in their culture, that family had to be together. I laughed uncomfortably and looked at Oksana, expecting her to say no, that we were adults and needed our space. But she just smiled and said it was a good idea, that we'd save money and could plan the wedding better. I'm not going to lie. The idea gave me a bad feeling, like a really bad feeling, because I had my apartment, a small but comfortable place in the city where I'd been living for like 3 years. But Oksana started pressuring, saying it would only be a few months, that her mom would be offended if we said no, that in her culture this was important. So, basically, I agreed because what else was I going to do? I didn't want to start my marriage causing family drama. I sold some of my furniture, put the rest in storage, and in February of this year I moved into her parents' house, a big house in the suburbs, like one of those houses that look nice on the outside, but inside they have this kind of strange air. I don't know how to explain it, like it was more of a stage set than a home. From day one, things felt weird. Svetlana had these very specific rules about everything, like what time you had to be home, what you could eat and when, where I could park my car. And she talked all the time in their language with Igor and Oksana. And when I'd walk into the room, they'd get quiet or switch to English, but in a very obvious way, like superficial conversations about the weather or dinner. Oksana would tell me not to be paranoid, that they just felt more comfortable speaking in their native language, that there was nothing weird. But I started to feel this constant discomfort, like when you know they're talking about you, but you can't prove it. The conversations about money started about a month after I moved in. First, it was Svetlana asking me about my job, how much exactly I made, if I had savings, if I had investments, and I'd answer because I thought she was just curious or wanted to make sure I could support her daughter, which I understand. It's her daughter. But then Igor started making comments about investment opportunities, that he knew people, that he could help me grow my money. And Oksana was suddenly very interested in me opening a joint bank account with her. She said that way we'd be a real team, that married couples had to share everything. I told her, let's wait until after the wedding, that there was no rush, and she got weird, like upset but trying not to show it. And Svetlana also made passive-aggressive comments about trust and commitment. It was around that time, like March or early April, when I decided to do something that sounds kind of crazy, but that ended up basically saving my life. I started taking classes in the language they spoke. I didn't tell them anything, obviously. I just found an online tutor and started taking lessons 2 or 3 times a week from my office during lunch. Honestly, I don't know what motivated me to do it. Maybe it was just curiosity, or maybe subconsciously I knew something was wrong and I wanted to understand what the hell they were saying all the time. The language was difficult, very different from English, but I've always been good with languages, and the tutor told me I had a knack for learning. After like 2 months of classes, I could understand basic phrases. Not everything, but enough to get the general idea of conversations. And that's when I started noticing things that gave me goosebumps. One night I was in my room, supposedly reading but actually trying to listen to the conversation that Svetlana and Oksana were having in the kitchen, and I heard Svetlana say something about timeline and bank and my name. I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough to know they were talking about me and money, and some kind of plan with specific dates. My heart started beating super fast, and I felt like the room was shrinking. The next day at work, I was completely distracted. I couldn't concentrate on anything, and my coworker Emma, who happens to speak the same language as Oksana's family because her parents are from that region, I noticed I was acting strange and asked me if everything was okay. I almost never talk about my personal life at work, but that day I was so stressed that I told her a little, like that I was living with my future in-laws and that I felt something weird was going on. Emma looked at me with this serious expression and said, "Do they speak such and such language?" And I said yes, and she told me, "Look, I don't want to scare you, but there are known scams of people from that region who marry Americans to get their money. Have you noticed anything suspicious?" That conversation left me frozen. That night I decided I needed evidence. Something concrete that would prove if my suspicions were real or if I was just being paranoid. I bought one of those small digital recorders on Amazon. It arrived in 2 days with Prime, and I started recording conversations when I wasn't home. I'd leave the recorder hidden in the living room or kitchen, places where they usually talked, and then I'd listen to them with headphones in my car before going into the house. The first recordings didn't have anything very incriminating, just normal conversations about food or weekend plans, but I kept recording because something told me that eventually they were going to talk about what they were really planning. The recording that changed everything I made on a Thursday night in May. I had supposedly gone out to buy milk, but really, I just drove around the block for 20 minutes while the recorder kept running in the kitchen. When I got back, the recorder had captured a heated argument between Oksana and Svetlana. That night, I listened to it in my car in a Walmart parking lot, with my hands shaking as I tried to understand what they were saying. And although I only caught like 50% of the words, what I understood was enough to confirm my worst fears. They were talking about me, about how much time was left until the wedding, that they needed to accelerate the process of getting access to my bank accounts, that I was being difficult and didn't trust enough. The next day I took the recording to work and asked Emma if she could listen to it and translate it for me. She agreed. We went to an empty conference room. She closed the door, and I gave her the recorder with the headphones. I watched her listen in silence, her expression going from neutral to worried to completely horrified. When she finished, she took off the headphones and looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Eric, this is very bad." Recording Svetlana was yelling at Oksana that she had taken too long, that they had a timeline to meet, that other targets had been easier to manipulate, that she needed to get access to my accounts before the wedding, because after it would be more legally complicated, that Igor had already identified other candidates if I turned out to be too much work. I couldn't breathe. I literally felt like someone had punched me in the stomach with all their strength. Emma put her hand on my shoulder and told me I needed to go to the police immediately. That this wasn't just a girlfriend trying to steal from me, that this sounded like an organized operation, like a family criminal enterprise. I could only sit there processing that my entire relationship of almost 2 years had been a lie, that the woman I was going to marry had never loved me, that I was just a mark, a target, a victim on a list. That afternoon I called my parents, Kenneth and Deborah, and told them everything. Furious, my mom started crying, and they both told me to come to their house immediately, to never go back to that house again, that they were going to handle this. But I told them I needed to get my stuff first, that I had important documents, my work laptop, my passport, and that if I just disappeared, they were going to notice and probably try to find me or do something. We decided to make a plan. My parents were going to come on Saturday, supposedly to get to know Oksana's family better before the wedding, and during that visit, I'd take advantage to discreetly get my most important belongings out and put them in my dad's car. But before doing anything, I went with Emma to talk to a police officer, Lawrence, who works in the fraud division. We showed him the recording, Emma did an official written translation, and Lawrence listened to everything very carefully. When we finished, he told me this definitely seemed to be marriage fraud, and that it was probably part of a larger operation. He asked me if I had more evidence, photos, text messages, emails, and I told him I had some weird conversations with Oksana where she was really pushing for the joint account. Lawrence gave me his card and told me to proceed carefully, that these people could be dangerous if they felt cornered, to document everything I could but not to put myself at risk. Saturday came, and my parents showed up at Svetlana and Igor's house with a bottle of wine and fake smiles. Oksana looked nervous, but was trying to act normal. Svetlana was being super nice in that aggressive way she has, offering food and drinks and talking about wedding plans. While they were entertained in the living room, I went upstairs to my room and started putting clothes in a suitcase, documents in my backpack, chargers, medicines, all the essentials. My mom came up after a while with the excuse that she needed to use the bathroom and helped me get some boxes down the back stairs, while my dad kept everyone distracted with questions about the traditional ceremony that Svetlana wanted to do. We managed to get out like 70% of my stuff without anyone noticing. The plan was for me to come back during the week with an excuse to get the rest, but the important thing was I already had the essentials. That night I slept at my parents' house for the first time in months, and it was like being able to breathe after being underwater for a long time. The next day, Sunday, Oksana started calling me and sending me messages, asking where I was, saying she was worried, and I responded that I'd had a family emergency, that I'd be back soon. But on Monday, when I was supposed to go back, I sent her a message saying we needed to talk, that things weren't working out, that I needed space. She exploded. The messages started coming one after another, first begging me to talk, then getting angry, then threatening me in veiled ways. Svetlana also started calling me, leaving voicemails where she alternated between sounding worried and sounding upset. I didn't answer any calls, just saved all the messages as evidence. Meanwhile, Lawrence had been investigating using the information I'd given him, and about 3 days later he called me and asked me to come to the police station. When I arrived, he told me something I still have trouble processing. This wasn't the first time this family had done this. Apparently, after investigating, they had found at least 3 previous cases of men who had been involved with Oksana or with other women in this family's network. One had lost like $50,000 before realizing. Another had been basically blackmailed after they convinced him to put properties in the family's name. And a third had reported the case, but nothing had ever been done because he didn't have enough evidence. Lawrence told me my recording was the most solid piece of evidence they'd had so far, that with it they could proceed with criminal charges. He asked me if I was willing to testify, and I said yes immediately, like without hesitating for even a second. The next few months were legal chaos. I had to give statements, identify documents, explain chronologically how I'd been manipulated. The most humiliating part was having to admit in front of strangers how blind I'd been, how many signs I'd ignored, how I'd let them convince me to do things that went against my instinct. But Lawrence and his team were very professional. They treated me like a victim, not like an idiot, which I appreciated. They discovered that the operation was even more elaborate than we thought. Svetlana basically ran this like a business. She had a system for identifying targets, single men with stable jobs, without close family or with family that lived far away, and then she'd send Oksana or other women in the network to meet them at specific events. In September, there was a preliminary hearing where I had to testify. Seeing Oksana there, sitting with her lawyer, was surreal. She didn't look at me once. Svetlana, on the other hand, stared at me with this expression of pure hatred, like as if I was the villain in this story. Their lawyer tried to argue that everything was a cultural misunderstanding, that the recorded conversations were out of context, but Emma also testified as an expert translator and made it very clear that there was no ambiguity in what they had said. that the words they used were specific to the context of fraud and didn't have any other reasonable interpretation. The case went to trial in November and lasted like 2 weeks. I had to miss a lot of work, which was stressful because even though my boss understood the situation, I still felt like I was leaving my team hanging. During the trial, more horrible details came out. That they had bank accounts in different states to launder money. That they had used fake identities in some cases. That they had connections with other similar networks in different cities. The prosecutor presented evidence of at least 7 victims over 5 years, with total losses of more than $300,000. I had been the most recent target, but had been lucky to discover it before they got money from me. The verdict came just before Thanksgiving. Guilty on all charges: fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, a bunch of things I didn't even fully understand. Svetlana got 12 years, Igor 8, and Oksana 5. Additionally, all 3 were going to be deported after serving their sentences because they were here on visas that were now going to be revoked. When the judge read the sentences, I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. Just this deep tiredness, like as if I'd run a marathon. My mom cried. My dad squeezed my shoulder, and we left the courthouse in silence. It's been almost 2 months since the verdict. I've been in therapy because it turns out being a victim of an elaborate fraud leaves you with a bunch of trust issues and paranoia. My therapist tells me I'm making progress, that it's normal to feel like I can't trust anyone, that that's going to improve with time. I've started dating some people again, nothing serious, just casual dates, but I get hypervigilant with any questions about my job or my financial situation, and I know that's not healthy, but I can't help it either. I moved back to my apartment, got my stuff out of storage, and I'm trying to rebuild the life I had before I met Oksana. Sometimes I feel stupid for having fallen for this. Other times I feel grateful for having discovered it when I did. Emma became a very close friend through all this. She and her husband invite me over for dinner often, and it's comforting to be with people who know the whole story and don't judge me. The other day we were having dinner, and her husband asked me if I'd ever get married again, and I told him honestly that I didn't know, that maybe someday. But right now, the idea terrified me. Emma laughed and said that was understandable. And we toasted to being single and to discovering in time when something is rotten. Lawrence sent me a message last week telling me that thanks to my case, they'd been able to identify and contact other possible victims, that they were building additional cases against other people in the network. He told me my courage in testifying had probably saved other people from going through the same thing, and although I appreciate his words, I don't feel particularly courageous. Rather, I feel like someone who got lucky and decided to do something about it. I still have bad days where I think about all the moments I spent with Oksana and wonder what was real and what was acting, if she ever felt anything genuine, or if from day one at that networking event, I was just a number on her list. I'll probably never know, and I guess I have to make peace with that. In the biggest lesson I got from all this, apart from the obvious ones about red flags and trusting your instincts, is that when something feels wrong, it probably is because it's wrong. I felt something was off from the beginning, but I ignored that little voice in my head because I wanted to believe I was in love, that I'd found someone special. Next time, if there is a next time, I'm going to listen to that voice. And if someone pressures me to have access to my money, or makes me feel guilty for wanting to maintain boundaries, or rushes me to make important decisions, I'm going to run in the opposite direction without looking back.